That's actually been helpful. You know, just follow the changes, follow the colors.
Did you incorporate the committee amendments from last week into this version?
They should, the version, yes, they are.
I know the legislature doesn't do it till it goes to the floor.
Yeah, we were having a hard time trying to.
Yeah.
And you're running out of colors.
Right. I noticed that. And depending on the printer, the color printer that you utilize, that's certainly true.
That's good why their names there.
Do we want to give people a couple more minutes to start?
What list are you expecting, in addition to Senator Drake?
I did not get confirmation back from the AT&T folks, but I was expecting more of the of our standing committee to be here. They're not here now. And Joe Abadi, I didn't get his feedback from him either.
Eric, are you signing as you or me? I'm signing in as you. I'll sign it as you.
That should work.
I have a yes person. Ms. Nell is here. Mario is here. Stephen Zylstra said yes. Elvisberg, is that right? Said maybe. Who is Elvisberg?
Oxbury.
Oxbury.
I'm
sorry, I can't tell from this.
Yes.
Again.
Yeah.
Mike Curtis, did Mike Curtis respond?
Mike, I did not hear back from Mike either. Very good. Why don't we go ahead and get started, and then we can go back on any particular issue as others come in. Let's see now. Right now, Eric, you have 1403 up. Do we want to have discussion 1402?
Yeah, we should probably do a roll call.
Okay, you bet. Mike Healing, let's go ahead and start the meeting. And if I could start with a roll call on of those folks that are on the phone. If you would go ahead now, please.
I didn't hear anybody join. I can't see, but I didn't hear a couple of them join. Maybe on mute.
We didn't hear anyone on the phone. Could we have roll call from those folks on the phone, please? So there are a couple of folks, Jeff, that you see. Okay.
Well, it was only one. That was me joining.
Okay.
Well, and I just talked to Mark Masterson 5 minutes ago. He said he's going to be on the phone.
Join. Okay. Very good. Well, hearing none on the phone, why don't we start here in the room again? Mike Keeling, Keeling Law Offices, and to my left is
Mike DeMaria, CenturyLink. Eric Thomas, Broadband Grant.
Susan Annable, Cox Communications.
Michael Stoll with Cox Communications.
Mike Golden with Asset.
Galen Updike, Asset.
Jeff Crane with Asset.
Janine Allen with City. Susan Bittersmith, Arizona Mexico Cable Association.
very good. And I think we do want to start with 1402. Any preface discussion before we go into the bills from anyone?
It might be useful, with your permission, because it's been sort of an ongoing the last number of years, as long as I've been doing this, which is longer than I want to acknowledge. But the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, it's been this ongoing discussion about deployment of broadband and where the problem is and how many homes actually are disenfranchised. And there was a little bit of that exchange even yesterday, but that I've observed but didn't participate in. I'm really concerned that I think we're all on the same page about what we want to accomplish, but if we're not operating off the same fact sheet, we're going to really create problems. And so I think we need to have some clarity about what those numbers really are. I know you were concerned about that, Susan, and I'm concerned about that. And I just need to be honest with you, the cable industry has a series of numbers we're pretty confident in. I don't think they're the numbers that the other half of the room is agreeing to, and I think we ought to have some kind of at least agreement on what those numbers are, or an agreement to disagree or something, because I don't want us to be colonizing bad information to anybody, whether it's an elected official or just a homeowner who's a user. So I asked Susan to bring, as Galen knows, the industry the cable industry 4 years ago did a mapping project. The numbers we're confident in. They're 4 years dated. That we think sort of describe the scenario in Arizona, has actually pulled in some national broadband mapping numbers. I know that the state has done mapping, but I've never seen a collective composition of that data in terms of percentages or homes, and I didn't do the math and kind of clicking on the address. But, our maps and our numbers in the national data differ than what I'm hearing and seeing in the fact sheets on both bills. And I just think we ought to decide what the facts are, and then move on to fixing the agreed-upon problem, if that's useful, because I still want to shoot at each other if we can avoid that. So that's what I wanted to see if we could sort through, and these are the numbers that came off the cable industry study, which was not just, and then, and as some of you worked in support, I don't want to belabor it, the mechanism here. I mean, these are not numbers generated by Homes Passed. These are actual customer counts presented by some fairly extensive data that we put together, and it's just the cable industry, it doesn't include any other providers. But those numbers tell a little bit different story than what I'm seeing in the fact sheets, and I think Susan has some national numbers too that are some national data collected, not by the cable industry, but reflect Arizona numbers that are a little bit different than the fact sheets too. So I don't know if did you bring those?
I did. I don't know how many copies I have. I think I have about half a dozen.
We need to make more copies, we can.
We can find them and pass the rest around. And I'm sure you guys have seen this. This is the National Broadband Plan numbers, the National Broadband Map for Arizona, state of Arizona.
And, essentially what, and I'm going to rely more on these numbers than even ours, because these are more current numbers than ours. It looks like there's about 5% of Arizonans that don't have access to any level of broadband. A problem we need to fix, clearly, but it's a little different than what I've been hearing in testimony and in fact sheets. And I don't want us, we're going to be having to justify why we're doing it and support or concerns in the bill. I just don't want us to be saying different things. So help me understand why the numbers we're working off of are different than perhaps what others are saying.
I think there is a matter of definition, probably. The word homes passed may not be widely understood as it represents availability. And so and anecdotally tied to that, we have received numerous criticisms of the broadband map. I don't know how extensively we documented that, but from all over the state, who say, gee, we don't have that coverage that you say we have. So we're going from what is being presented by the providers. Anecdotally, we're being presented different information by people who have looked at the maps and said, that's not accurate.
Yeah, the map shows that we have the service, and in fact, we don't have the service available to us. When we actually go to the websites of the providers, it does not match up with the data that's presented. Now, we are speculating, but we guess that some of that is caused by the definition of homes passed. If homes passed are submitted at a franchise territory level, there are often gaps where the other criteria of the NTIA mapping, that service can be delivered within 10 days of a request, is often not actually a meetable criteria on certain streets and certain places. So that may be one issue. But an even broader issue is the kind of constantly changing definition of what broadband is too. This early data was all based on the lowest possible definition of speed. We know that the FCC is about to up that level of speed to 4 megabits instead of where it was. And in fact, I'd like to, one of the things that the cable industry has done very good is the establishment of the DOCSIS 3 standard and the real quality of speeds that are delivered by DOCSIS 3. So I think a question that we would be asking is, where in this map is DOCSIS 3, really available, and how soon will it be available, especially outside of metro areas?
My guess is, Maurice, and that's kind of, I think you're taking what I've always understood to be our difference of opinion is at what level are we defining speed,
yes.
and as served or unserved. And that may be a difference of opinion that we can't resolve. I don't know, because clearly most of the operators across the state, about 90% of them, do the Cox model, and Cox is they operate in the room, so I'm going to deflect them. I'm the biggest operator in the state, but they are by far not the only operator, nor are they any different than even some of my smaller operators.
Sure.
What Cox is doing in Phoenix is also what now Suddenlink is doing in Havasu and Bullhead, which is offering different levels of service.
Sure.
And so people have choices in terms of level of service. And so although there is speculation about what the FCC may do, they haven't done it yet. And so we operate off of, that figure versus the current figure versus the speculative figure of what the FCC might do. And that may be where we're
I think that's a portion of it. But I think you'd also acknowledge that clearly the definition of what constitutes adequate speed is really a rapidly moving upward target. Now, I agree with you, the FCC hasn't,
I think it may be a matter of opinion in terms of, what the consumer tells us, and I guess that's why I'm raising the question, and it's a discussion Gail and I have had many times. We've never reached agreement, I don't think, but we've argued pretty proficiently on both sides.
So Mike?
Hello?
Mike, this is Mark Masterson.
Hi, Mark.
Yes.
And I understand you're arguing about what historically was, but the Department of Education of the state of Arizona is leaning towards the future and what we need for future bandwidth. And if we're using 650K as a standard and that's acceptable, from our department that is not acceptable.
768 is the Fed standard right now.
And Mark, you mean that not just for what a school is able to receive, but for what a community can have available. Is that a fair statement?
Well, because our future is blended learning, which means what they get at school they should have all at home. Have the offer, now will the state pay for that? No. But they should have the capability to be able to access the same kind of bandwidth so that they could do what they do in school at home.
Well, Mark, if I can add, this is Mike DeMaria from CenturyLink, because I want to try to at least help you understand where we're trying to get to. I don't think anyone thinks a standard that low is what we want. That's not where we're, but when we try to put language together, which makes it a much more difficult thing on the definitions, one of the things we put in there was the current definition, knowing that at some point it will change, which then gets incorporated into the provisions that are here. So even though it's written today as what it is with the FCC February 22nd, when that changes, that the data moves with it.
And I think we can, Mike, to your point though, I think we can all maybe accept the fact that when that change occurs, which is probably in the reasonably near future, that's going to dramatically affect these maps in the sense of what qualifies and what doesn't qualify, especially in rural Arizona.
Well, to the point, at least from our perspective, of we went down to the cross box level when we submitted our data to NTIA. So it is literally down to the street level of what's available, what's not. I mean, we're pretty confident that those numbers aren't going to vary substantially when that threshold changes, because it's still going to be, those are the areas, we know what they are, they still need, right, to move forward beyond where they're at. So the places that have a lower threshold are definitely not going to be around metros. They're not going to be around mid-metros. are gonna be outside of that.
And I think we've all kind of agreed.
Right, and we
to that.
think that's still gonna need to be addressed, even with the change upward, if we think the number goes to where we think it's gonna go.
Yeah, there are pockets even within those areas that,
And within the metro areas,
Within
but it's a
metro.
rural issue. Excuse me, yes.
But going back to the first issue of what we're talking about, there is a difference in how you define it. If you're going to take a percentage that says that Arizona Homes, because I know even amongst the providers, Cox uses Homes Pass, CenturyLink uses living units. There's also a standard in some of the cable agreements called occupied housing units. Just for the city of Tempe, I can't get the same number. There's a different, when I've looked at statistics on occupied housing units, when I've looked at MAG aggregate numbers, even when I'm looking for the same years, there's a difference. So there's one number for occupied housing units between the two, the census and the MAG studies. There's another number for for living units. There's another number for Homes Pass. So when I look at something like this, to me, every word becomes important. If you're saying 96% of all Arizona homes, homes might be something very different. And I think that the purpose is access not only to just homes, but to schools and to businesses and to places. So I don't think just homes.
I agree with that. It's the whole
I don't think
community.
that's the end of it.
Right, but that's a different conversation around solutions.
Yeah.
If you're going to talk about the, connectivity to all the institutions we've been talking about in the development of the plan, the hospitals, the libraries, the schools, having capacity to serve those entities is different than talking about the residential, the homes that have capacity for the service. And even having, we've tried to illustrate the point, having capacity for the service at the home, there's lots of reasons people don't take broadband in the home, and it may have nothing to do with the fact that they have providers available. And so I think it's important that we are clear about what are apples and what are oranges when we're talking about the scope of the problem and the solution, and making sure that people don't mistake the access issue for the adoption issue. And that's, I think
we clearly agree that adoption is an important issue as well as availability. So, but on the other hand, it's not a forced choice. Availability is important, adoption is important.
Right.
It's not one or the other.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to, just for clarification, when we go to the cross-box level, it's not just homes, it's everything in that sector.
Mm-hmm.
It's businesses, it's schools, it encompasses everything. So I just want you to know it's not, when we run to those numbers, it's everything served off of that one box, which is in that loop. And that's how we define it.
There's another factor that
And
we're
I think
also
we
thinking
understand.
forward with, and as I'll give first an example. When Flagstaff schools used to turn their systems on in the morning, the entire business district within which those broadband capacity was delivering both the schools and the businesses used to kind of drain them kind of to the bottom of the list, and they would lose. So the question might be simultaneous access.
Well, simultaneous
anybody
access in our world,
Doesn't
it's a
I
non-entity because everything is a dedicated line. So when we serve, so just so you know, from when we put cross-box numbers in, it's capacity to each individual location, because it is not shared. It's a complete dedicated service.
Well, you still have traffic concentration issues, though, back deeper into the network, do you not?
Not like the old days. It's not
okay.
quite as difficult as it was before.
Right.
Okay, but in some instances, especially with, say, a wireless delivery, simultaneous access would be a factor. I know from practical experience it has.
I think more fundamental is that we're trying to understand why there are objections to the model that's being proposed, in which basically all that we're really proposing to do is to aggregate rights-of-way available on state properties and bundle those and make them more speedily available and available at on a less costly basis for the potential deployment of backhaul capacity. So why is that seen as a limitation?
Well,
It isn't, Mike, that's, I mean, that's not a problem.
This bill,
1402, 1403.
Okay.
I have no issues with this bill.
Okay.
And actually, I put in a ticket of support on
But
this
it
bill, so it's, that particular process that we've talked about over the summer,
Sure.
I have no issues.
Because that should be good for all players, is the basic point.
And we agree with that. The reason I raised the initial question, it has to do, I think, ultimately with 1403, not 1402. And I know you heard a year ago from the collective cable industry about, their challenges, and you've heard of some other providers too about rights of way. It says we move forward on 1403 and 1402, and the conversation you're having with elected officials advocating for a conversation we want to join, we need to have our facts straight. And if I'm going to have to stand up and say, you just heard that there's 2 million Arizonans that don't have access to broadband, well, that's not really quite, I don't want to have that debate. I want to all be collectively in support of what we agree about.
Susan,
That's
I feel fairly safe, though, when I look at these numbers versus the data that we're accumulating through the mapping process, that there is, in fact, a disconnection between what these numbers represent as availability of broadband, especially in rural Arizona, outside of the metro areas, from the data that we've been collecting over the now 2 years.
See, that's my challenge, is your data and my data, which I'm collecting with.
And remember, the data that we're collecting ultimately comes from you and all of the other
which is why I'm
providers.
concerned, because we're coming from the same source and we're coming up with different conclusions. I mean, that's the reason, and it's maybe a conversation for a later point, but I think it's something to keep in mind. And we can ultimately agree to disagree. But if we're going to do that, then let's don't use that as our advocacy message. Let's use a different advocacy message that we can all agree on.
Well, I agree, and one of the things that we are now taking on as a task as a result of this conversation is to, in fact, go back and look at the data that we've collected and turn it into some comparable apples-to-apples kinds of data sets,
I think that's
such that we can actually, even if we agree to disagree, we can look at that and say, well, here's why.
I think that's a great idea.
And we can do shades of gray also.
Now, that will take us, we can't do that instantly, but it'll take us a
No,
little bit of
and
time.
I'm not advocating that to have that, because session's going to be coming and gone before we get that resolved. My only concern was, we're moving along, and we want to talk about 1403. Again, we're all kind of at the same goal. We want to be on the same page. I don't want us to be arguing our own facts.
Yeah.
So if we can kind of take up and describe the problem more generally versus...
Well, actually, I think we're going to have some of that data available within a couple of weeks. Is that a fair?
Actually, it should be this week.
Yeah, so it's not before the end of the session. I mean, I think we'll have some substantive data.
There were some large, shall we say, areas of concern in the original data collection that we're now being asked to verify and re-verify. And I just saw something that came back from the FCC yesterday.
As late as yesterday.
As late as yesterday, that talks about shape files being inaccurate as reported by WISP.
Yes.
And what we're talking about is, in every case, the accurate data is an understatement of the advertised rates. The verification data shows us that most of the reported situation is by nature overstated, because they're asked for advertised rates and maximum rates available reporting. And so our verification data comes out and we see average rates and actual rates reported substantially lower than that. And we have a fairly large, consistent database of both crowdsourcing data from the FCC and from other sources that is showing, shall we say, a gradual statement that is much lower than is.
Yeah. On the other hand, a place of consistency from verification data is the availability data.
Relatively speaking.
Yeah, relatively speaking. Those are much closer in alignment with reported data from the providers and the verification data.
And the other thing, I would simply add is that, at least on the cable industry side, a lot of the data that we collected, and admittedly it's 4 years old, but I think that the FCC has, is data that goes actually to the city of Tempe, and because we're licensed individually by municipalities, there's no gray area there, because that's an audited piece of information that is predicated upon not only rates and charges, but also homes passed and paying customers. So There's a back channel way of checking, at least from the cable perspective side. Now, that doesn't encompass maybe all the other providers, but, there's ways of working beyond this anecdotal process
Right.
and looking at.
And that's what we're trying to do with the data we have, is to make it not be anecdotal, but to make it actually
And that's what we try with our
solid.
map, I just wanted you to know that.
And one of the problems we also have, for example, I think the entire county of Yavapai County is listed as a franchise area. And some instances, and we don't have good definition
Well,
circling
then that's
back.
an error on your data, because licenses are granted by cities there. There's also unincorporated areas of county, but Prescott Valley all have separate licenses and reported separately, and that's how we gathered.
Okay, so you're actually doing it by community then?
Yeah, because that's how we can check it through, we do it by license area.
And we have county licenses, we have municipal licenses, so within a Yavapai County, you're gonna have unincorporated areas that report homes passed under the Yavapai County license, and then each individual
Outside
city
the city
within their
boundaries.
city boundaries will report.
So you have to
But
look
it's
at
just
this.
homes, right? Where it's not businesses, or
It's
when you're
homes,
going in to
correct.
do broadband.
Mhm, yeah.
So one of the puzzlements I have about the objections to 1403 is it seems like the general thrust of the conversation has been to try to constrain the number of communities that can be passed with this fund.
That's 1402, isn't it?
Well, 1402 is the physical act of doing that, but 1403, my sense is, and maybe I'm wrong, is that the objection to 1403 is that there's going to be decisions made about which communities could be served by that potential capacity and which would not be. And the question I have is, if this potential capacity is just that, potential capacity, why is there an objection to having that be available within rural communities? It won't be used if it isn't needed, and it would be used by providers if it is needed.
I don't think that's the objection.
Okay, well then I'm not getting what the objection is, and so we need.
But one of the purposes of this meeting is to try to understand those issues.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
And I don't want to drive the conversation. I think that to speak to 1402, which we think is important and does exactly what you're describing, I don't know, at least for people in this room, that there's any objection, and quite frankly has been support. And I want to say, at least from the industry's perspective, from the cable side, and I know Michael, same feeling, is the tweaks and changes that were made to 1402 greatly improved the bill, and we stand ready to support that all the way through as your advocate partner.
Okay.
The only thing I would raise was, if we do that, I think it would be easier for us to do that as if in the testimony we weren't standing up and saying different things about.
It would be nice if we're not disagreeing. Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
That's my point.
And I got that.
So if we could get that together,
I
I
don't
think
think that we've ever, other than a statement made the other day, I think about 2 million homes versus, I don't think there's ever been a discussion as to penetration or availability.
She's circling earlier. Let me move beyond that. I just want to make sure going forward we're not counter-challenging each other. And let's just talk about what we need to fix.
Did someone just join the conversation on the phone?
Yeah, Ron Schott, Mike.
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Ron. Certainly one of our objectives is to try to get to what the data is and to agree around the table on that.
Or agree as much as we can.
As we can.
One of the reasons 1402, I think, has been more successful than 1403 is you actually have definable parameters within it, populations, that kind of thing. When you have two different parties and they're trying to define things differently using statistical data that's being tortured, doesn't matter who's doing it, you're going to come up with different solutions and you're not going to have agreement. If you're going to find agreement in 1403, you're going to have to come up with similar parameters that can be defined that like are used in 1402.
Now, of course, one of the reasons for 1403's existence, a primary reason for it, is that ADOT, from the very beginning, from the very first conversation, has said, we do not want to take on, as an agency, the actual management of this capacity as it's made available, other than the physical construction and management of the capacity. So we don't want to have to deal with the providers. I don't know why they don't want to talk to you guys, but...
Chad, I can't answer.
Oh, they talk to us plenty.
But they have insisted that there be a different organization to actually manage all of those issues. So that is a really principal reason for the existence of 1403. So we need to delve into,
I was going to say, Mike, to that point, and this is sort of an important question for us today as we're sort of getting to the heart of the remaining issues in 1403. Is it important? Is there a compelling legal reason why you have to create a new separate office within DOA. You have an asset office, you have a chief information officer, you have an agency that's been able to apply for and get federal funds and administer mapping and planning functions. What, if you, short of putting all the things in place, the additional authorities you need to actually do the digital highways program, what's the need of an office and a board?
The principal one that I understand, and add to this, Mike, as you see appropriate, is that we do expect to create a fund that will be a revolving fund that will, take the lease revenues from leasing the capacity and then reapply those to providing ADOT with the funds to continue doing additional construction. And frankly, we're worried that if it's not in a separate quote-unquote office, those funds can be swept.
They can be swept anyway.
And well, except that there's another level of immunity from that by creating the office that really does create.
I don't think it makes a hill of difference.
Well, there's that aspect. The other aspect is the fund is actually overseen by the state treasurer, and under the current situation, that's not possible with the ABOA. But what that does do is, which is I think actually more important from your perspective, because the funds are going to be provider funds, in addition to grant funds
and grants funds.
And they're not going to be general fund monies, but grant funds and provider funds. And so this is a place for providers to put funds in an escrow account that ADOT pulls out of that escrow account for planning, engineering, getting a civil engineer and doing the civil engineering for the conduits in the roadways for new roadways or expansions of roadways, and then for once the constructor partners are in place to pay for that. So it's an escrow account. It's a protected escrow account because in reality, in many of these cases, it's going to be provider dollars that are upfront dollars on long-term leases. You're going to say, I want a long-term lease for this bundled right-of-way from Phoenix to pick a place, and you're going to say, and there's going to be some analysis and engineering done, and it's going to and you're going to work out a temporary lease rate or a lease rate not to exceed a number, and then you're going to be asked to put those dollars into an escrow account, and you don't want that escrow account to disappear in the middle of the night. So this 1403, a very important fundamental foundational point of 1403 is to have a safe place for those funds that is not only safe from the provider's perspective, but from ADOT's perspective is no different than other funds that it pulls out of the state treasurer's office as it does the planning, engineering, and design of the highways. But that's the upfront, that's the financial mechanism. That's the banking aspect of the bill, which is not in place at this point.
Yeah. Personnel who staff the office, how are they going to derive a salary? Where's it going to be funded from?
They're employees of ADOA, and so their salary is as determined by ADOA and the board.
That's the staff as opposed to the board, and uncompensated.
And the board is non-paid.
So no new FTEs for the program?
Not necessarily. As the program matures, there may be some staffing issues that will be handled through grants and other opportunities. Right now, there's a grant that supports
and usually
not general fund or not on this fund. It would be based on grant.
Yeah, in fact, we hope that the language in there says that no general funds will ever be used for anything involving
It does say that, and so those additional FTEs are grant by grant by grant if available within those grant cycles, as opposed to.
It's happening today, though. There's some grant money. So
correct.
Help me understand and why you couldn't have the separate funds in the asset office, which is a different but almost similar component to the 911 funds that are there, that are separate funds managed by the state treasurer's office, existing state agency monitors. They actually encumber those funds after they got swept a couple times. They finally figured out how to do that. Why would you not want to model it after that?
If we have, two things. First of all, there's another factor that pertains to why we want a legislative bill to create a 1403. That is because as we move from administration to administration, we need to have a policy in place that doesn't come from the current executives, okay? And the other thing is, as we also go out to the federal grant process, it is helpful to have a legislative office or an office for broadband, some kind of office that for which we can talk about grants.
Well, which can become the applicant for and
which can become the applicant for and which can be a center of influence for. We have seen a huge increase in states that have a center of influence stated as policy in the number of grants they're able to, in fact, go after, versus those states which have no office or center of influence. Now, what we call it is completely, we started out, for example, with the word authority, and that was absolutely objectionable to everybody, including the current administration, and also probably to the ears of many legislators. And we backed off just because of purposes of acceptability to the word office, and much higher acceptability. We've constrained almost every aspect of that office to be centered on supporting transportation, ADOT in their work, and so, but we need something that will survive, for example, an administration.
Mike, what are the other rationales that you...
Well, and Susan, to your point on what was it model on WIPA, the water infrastructure finance folks that are
class I seem to share with you out of the treasurer's office. They've been the victim of that a couple times. So.
But that's the model where it's a separate board. It fits within an existing agency rather than having a separate agency and a separate bureaucracy.
They have appropriated funds.
And but here we don't have any appropriated funds. But in terms of the governance, it's and then there was previously a similar program that was within the Department of Commerce when it existed that would make available funds through a process in commerce for infrastructure, typically wastewater and things of that nature.
And we think having an independent, non-compensated board is an important component of this as well, as opposed to having it be an ADOA function which directly reports, to the or any administration. So
that's what I guess part of what we're trying to sort out, because I'm obviously very familiar with the WIPA model, which is a little different in the sense that, and they get bonding authority, and on top of that, those employees are compensated. If the board doesn't set employee salaries or hire and fire or do any of that, that is strictly a state function. I'm not hearing that exactly as to how you anticipate this.
This is a state function.
Well, the model is described in the bill, or at least we think it's described in the bill, is that the support staff that's being provided by ADOA actually gets reimbursed for the cost of those logistics support personnel.
That's not what happens in WIPA.
Yeah, and so that is different, I agree.
But no, that was part of not having any funds coming from the general fund.
Right.
For the purposes of staff here. That's why that's different. And that's different.
And initially, we see for the first couple of years, there are some funds that support that staff function that are coming out of the existing federal grants that can be purposed for that as a seed function. But part of creating sustainability is such that there eventually is a vision of additional sources of funds coming into that fund, and a portion of that would obviously be used to continue to support that staff.
I'm just playing devil's advocate a little bit here. If I'm a legislator and I hear that description, and you're now telling me that you want them to create a separate board that will ultimately adjudicate monies that are coming to the state, and these are non-elected people and then be appointed, that at the end of the day will essentially be usurping the role of the budget process, and monies will be coming in and going out outside the general fund model. That makes me nervous.
Actually, Senator Driggs' response was the exact opposite.
That make me personally nervous.
DES does that all the time.
Yeah.
Which is a model
so far the feedback has been they actually like it, because it all operates, in fact, outside the general fund. And so it's kind of neutral impact, basically, on the general fund.
Well, to that point, I'd like to better understand what are all the anticipated sources of revenue. I've definitely heard the grants, that we pursue additional federal dollars. I think that's awesome. Right. The lease revenues from leasing, broadband, conduit, right-of-way access. Mm-hmm. That will come in, and it's being described described as a self-sustaining. What if there's no takers, or if there's not enough takers on the leasing side to sustain the expense side needs of the
Well,
program?
obviously, two outcomes. One is it will grind to a halt if there's not alternate sources of funding, such as federal grants. But the vision is that we'll see some combination of those two things happen. We suspect that the leasing revenue will not be enough to be, self-sustaining absolutely ongoing into the future. But it could become a significant component of sustainability. And then I think federal grants or private grants, become a key element of that.
Now, and jumping back to 1402, because I just want to make sure I clearly understand how you guys envision this working. If a provider comes to this office and says, I have a need to get middle mile infrastructure from community A to community B, there's an ADOT highway, they've got a project plan, I want to put conduit in.
Mm-hmm.
Does the office, assuming they approve that request, do they pay ADOT to place the conduit and then collect a lease rate from the provider, or does the provider pay for the conduit, that basically pay ADOT to put their conduit in, and then they pay a lease rate?
The private provider pays into an escrow account, and from that escrow account, which is overseen by the state treasurer, pays ADOT, or the ADOT.
For the placement of the conduit and the lease?
Correct. The lease is the money going in, the payment for the conduit, planning, engineering, construction, and maintenance is the money going out of that account.
Right.
So that's a static amount that ADOT bills for? Is that how you
see
that
there
happening?
in 1402, Mike, they want, and this is extremely important for ADOT, is because they're criticized heavily if they have any indirect or direct expenses of using roadway money for non-roadway
That's
purposes.
what I'm trying to figure out.
They've been incredibly vocal about making sure that
Clear
we do not, that there's a clear dividing line between a conduit construction project and a normal road construction project.
And that's why there's a separate escrow account, and that's why they want to be able to draw. They don't want to promise that in the future on Tuesday,
No, because what I'm just
they want
trying
that escrow account to draw.
Because what I want to figure out is, number one, ADOT's going to have to be paid. We all know that.
Yeah.
And if they run into a making sure you have the money to do what you want to do, and they have the money to cover their costs, that
I think
somehow
a practical matter, the project doesn't get started until, those I's are dotted and those T's are crossed.
Or,
on it.
let me give you another
Let
example
me
of how
address
the
that
fund
real
might be used.
quickly, if I could, because that's tremendously important. And that's why it's an escrow account.
Right.
Is that once you put money in for a specific reason with those instructions, then the only way that money leaves that account is if those conditions are met, then those monies are paid.
Or a time limit is hit,
and that's why that's so important.
There's not
to
sufficient
provide
funds
it.
to do it, and funds are returned from the escrow account.
Yeah, because I again, I'm not advocating one way or another. That might be something that we might want to think about, because the concern I think I have is you're going to do this, create this, ADOT's prices, we're going to escrow. The actual work is going to be more than what that ties into. If they don't get paid right away, they draw down on that escrow further, which leaves you less money to administer. So it's something to think about, just at long range, because
It's an issue, and there may be some planning things that need to be done, such as contingency amounts that go into the escrow fund, subject to overruns and that kind of stuff. Or once again, it isn't done. But you're right. In the real world of constructing things, projects overrun.
And that's sort of maybe the broader issue is we're hearing how this might work or what the anticipation of how the fund might work, but that's not in the bill. And I don't think any of the providers have seen in writing this whole process. So maybe that's part of our concern, it is part of our concern, is some of those things shouldn't be in the bill, I understand, but there's no plan. Here's how this is going to work, here's how the fund's going to work. There's nothing in writing, at least that we've seen, maybe it does exist, to say, here, if I'm Cox, or if I'm Suddenlink, or if I'm Orbital Communications, I don't have a sense of exactly what this system is going to look like, or what the process is, or where the money goes or any of that, and I'm wondering if that exists, if that whole plan exists in writing.
That's the set of rules that come after the statute and the policies and procedures.
However, one of the things that we have foreseen that the way this board would operate is that there will be many, hearings with stakeholders involved in those hearings to thrash out what those rules become. It's not going to just be done in a black box.
Are you sure about that? Because I'm reading in the bill here, at least the Driggs Amendment, the original Driggs Amendment, in putting together a policies included coordination with state agencies and consulting with local and national telecommunications providers. In the amendment that was adopted, it chopped out local and national telecom providers. So basically what you'd be facing is a bureaucratic set of rules that wouldn't take into consideration input, or doesn't have to.
Our intention is that it does include, however, so I don't know why that.
When it was taken out, somebody objected to that.
Probably color-coded, right? We can see.
Yeah, can we trace down why that's not in there now?
We can trace that, right.
Yeah. I can't explain why that's not there, but it was not our intention. It did not go there.
It may not have been the intent, but it certainly was in the amendment, so that says something.
Got it, yeah.
Why don't you scroll down and find that?
And I understand the chicken and egg component. However, having done this a long time, typically, because if you're creating a new entity, even if it's a small one in government, it's always fraught with lots of questions and
Page 4.
And usually I'm used to seeing, and we're used to seeing, at least an overview, here's how the office will work, and we have not seen any of that. And with respect, I seem to share with you the process so far, at least on 1403, has been pretty piecemeal.
That's a good point, Susan, and I suspect here that in fairly short order we can draft up at least a draft of what the current vision is about how the office will operate, and that can become the basis of another conversation to bring some clarity.
I think that would be true.
Even though, to Mike's point, really the rule creating process needs to happen post statute, but nonetheless we can still talk about what we're thinking about.
One other additional thing. I anticipate a couple of different things, and with Mark on the phone, schools are a particular target for this, and also economic development areas. There is a very good possibility that an economic development group in a rural area could in fact apply for federal funds, and with an office like this, be assured that something could be built and could take some of the grant dollars and put them in this fund for the purposes of being dedicated to a project in their area, with a substantial amount of right-of-way then provided to them to make something happen on a basis. And so we have a number of things. The new title, for example, the 6th order from the FCC talks about opening universal service funds in E-rate areas for use. And the state of Washington, for example, built their entire fiber network on the back of E-rate universal service funds back in the day.
Well, one of the stated purposes of the office too is long-range planning in cooperation with the providers, such that there does emerge a consistent and agreed upon long-range strategic plan as well, involving all of the providers. Have you found the reason for why that?
Actually, I'd like to go to page 5, line 25, please.
Is this the old document?
No, this is the new document.
Okay,
The
but
current
he's working off of the old document.
No, he's got the correct one, line 25.
Well, Mike, just a question.
Yeah.
When I was online just before the meeting, and to compare what was said the latest amendment, it was 216 of 1010. And then I compared it with this version, which said stakeholder language as of February 11th.
Yes.
But I'm looking at that, this version doesn't have the blue, which is currently the AT&T.
Right.
So which
The
is
latest
the
version
one?
should have light blue on it, and I noticed in your legend it does not have it either. And so this is the version that was voted on in conference or in committee last Thursday, as you see. In fact, the light blue is the AT&T input.
Are you sure that, and the reason I question that is when I did the comparison, it showed the light blue language in an earlier version of the amendment, and the final version that came out did not include that language.
That light blue language only occurred when AT&T weighed in the evening before, like at 4:30.
So it's not in the amendment that's
So,
committee,
no, it should be, well, I'll go back and check that. That is the AT&T
I apologize if I'm
language.
mistaken, but I don't think it was included.
Let's take it as an action item, because the intent is for the blue to be there. It was actually provided in time to be read. It was not provided in time to be in the written version that was before the committee, and that's why there was a series of changes that were read during committee and approved by the committee prior to the vote. So we need to go back
What's
to
the
that.
lag time? I mean, this is, the most
We
recent
can't solve that here.
amendment that I saw online.
It's the adopted amendment.
is 216.
I'll go back and ask.
But we will find out, but
That's a good question. I'll
Would
go
it
back
get
and
on? I
ask
mean,
that.
this is the holiday.
I'll just ask.
But to Michael's point, you were about to take us to line 25 to address this.
Well, and that's because and consulting with local and national telecommunications providers, that is the AT&T ad in light blue.
So did it just move from the place where he sees it as missing to a different place in the,
No, this matches up, that line matches up with what I've written in manually within the original draft language.
okay, so it was added back then,
Well,
from whatever you're looking at.
in an earlier version of the amendment it was, but in the final version I showed it as stricken.
And now that's what we'll have to go work with Senate staff with regard
Well,
to.
anyway, the intention is clearly that it be in there, so we need to find out. If not, why not?
Welcome.
I think the challenge, and again, I don't want to speak for Michael, but I think I can from the cable operators. We're all in concern of ultimately, what you're describing could and should happen. The devil's always in the details, and our fear factor, because you asked what is the consumer on 14, our fear factor is the details aren't contained in 1403, and then there may need to be some to get us to a comfort level. It may be that we need to take some time to do that and take a step back to do some interim stuff in 1403. We'll work on those details. Again, I fully understand what you're suggesting is that you can't create policies for an entity that doesn't exist. But it goes back to the base question about why does there need to be a separate entity per se? Could you not take the existing asset offices and then put all these other tools, including the escrow fund, under that existing component?
Well,
I really
ADOT
haven't.
has decided what's not in, what is in 03 is not in 02, because we started with a bill, and that's what they required us to take out. So that's the history.
I'm not following.
Yeah. What's ADOT's condition there? Do they care as long as they're not responsible?
Yeah, but I understood that they don't want to be responsible. Why do they care what
do they care if it's an office?
Well,
or the
ADOT's
CIO
position is, that's a very good question, Susan. ADOT's position is that they're good at certain things, and they do not want to be drugged through the keyhole to be required to do a large number of other things other than what they're good at. And so they wanted to be very focused to building, designing, building, and maintaining roads and roadway safety.
But here's Susan's question being, would they care if it was an office or if it was just ADOA itself that took that burden off of them?
We can ask that question.
We fully understand they don't want to, we probably don't want them in that business either.
And the objection of the industry is that an office is unacceptable.
Yeah, and if so, why?
Why? Yeah.
I think the answer, quite frankly, is why do we need to create yet another office with a sort of yet-to-be-defined funding mechanism? I mean,
But if it were ADOA, it would still yet to be defined.
No, because you'd already have, your base operations would be state-funded. And we don't, there's a fee structure suggested in 1403 that we've yet to see or understand. I mean, I think that's suggested.
Is that the fear?
It's pretty significant
No,
figure, yes, yeah.
Because we're trying to find problems.
Yeah,
Is that the root problem?
I think it's,
Yeah, I mean, do we really need to create another office of government to do what you guys want to do, which we don't necessarily disagree with. I think that we can see that there is value in what the powers and duties and functions of the office will be, but do we need another office and another board who are people who are not elected, but yet will have responsibility for setting fees, for making decisions about who gets into the condo and who doesn't? It just feels like it's
So you'd rather have
one more step removed.
ADOA set those fees and
Well,
policies?
they have a process, a rulemaking process that they're accustomed to following. They can have some parameters set around what the CIO's responsibilities and duties are, and that can all be spelled out in legislation as opposed to being delegated to a board to come up with the rules down the road. And it's a matter of having some surety for the folks of us that are going to be looked to participate in this. And so we don't want this to be something that doesn't meet expectations, because everybody wants it to succeed. And the more certainty, the more specificity there, is that a word?
Yes, it
The
is.
more specifics there are
Close to one.
that are in the bill, the more comfortable we get with it. And I'll give you some real examples, and Bob, you know this well too, the challenges with budgets in the last few years. There's been more pressure put on agencies to fund themselves with fees collected from those that are regulated or stakeholders of those agencies, and those fees get collected and those fees get swept. And so the accountability issue is a little frightening for us when those fees aren't defined. What's the limit? What are they for? Why are we going to collect fees from the providers other than the leases? We get that.
So if I boil what I'm hearing down, the problem you're having is really the existence of an independent board, because if ADOA were doing this and they just called it an office, a functionality, an office, but it didn't have legislative imprimatur, well, it would still need some kind of...
Yeah, well, and ADOA has an office today, the asset office, right?
Right.
And that scope of that office could include these responsibilities.
Maybe, maybe not.
You could have an
Go back and
advisory
look at the
board.
legislation that created the asset office, because it basically moved GITA in, and that became the asset office, and I don't know that...
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you want to
Yeah, okay.
expand the scope of asset to include these responsibilities,
And you need to do
Have
that.
an advisory
You have to
board.
do that through legislation.
sure, I have no disagreement
But
with
so
that.
really,
Same thing.
the nub of the objection is the existence of an independent board, is what I hear. Is that a fair statement?
I don't know that it's the existence of it. It's its role and function in guiding the policy.
Or the
of this
definition
process.
around how that independent board would operate?
Yeah, I think to some degree.
And that's
What I hear her saying,
yes, Ron.
what I hear her saying is that you've got the potential for a unelected entity to potentially dictate pricing and policy.
I mean, that's part
Is that
of it.
an accurate
Yeah.
characterization?
We've already indicated that the basis of the cost will be informed mainly by Transportation Department as they come up with their estimates as to what these will cost. So they will be setters of the base price, if you will. And the only other thing that we're going to be talking about.
But it's a process and authority issue that they're concerned with.
That it's not defined in 1403 that is the precise process and the bounds and the limits. And I understand her question.
So Ron, are you saying limiting if we were to keep the board, which may or may not, but if we were to keep the board, then limiting language as to its powers, its processes, is that what you're saying?
Well, as soon as
required,
you can have an independent, non-compensated board and all that kind of stuff, but then you ask the question, what power do they have?
Yeah.
As opposed to advice. And if they are going to have some jurisdiction over money that is collected, that's where it gets really sticky.
And hence my earlier comment with respect to whatever Senator Driggs' thoughts were. If I were a legislator, I would be nervous about that prospect, and we can think of all kinds of federal grants that have gone astray because monies were never, distributed by somebody who ultimately had responsibility. Now, that may be your goal, is to get out from underneath having to deal with those, that scrutiny, but I don't think that's the best for public policy, and that's, I guess, why we've come back to understanding what you want to have accomplished, which nobody disagrees with. Why do we need to create yet another entity to do that? Can we not use the existing entity?
And you're saying you'd be more comfortable if that authority were ADOA's existing authority expanded by some additional definition
which you
of
may
their
need
role.
some,
right.
Because there's an accountability factor there that's built into that system different than a separate independent analog system.
And I think you guys have demonstrated the competency to do that. You guys went after and got those ARA grants. You guys have run that program. You guys have done this. And to me, it's like that's what you guys
we're pretty good at
do.
it, actually.
Yeah, you are. And so we're kind of like, well, why
And you know, Mike, I mean, I told you for 5 months straight, some of our fear from our corporate folks is as we deal with USF and the federal changes, that we're not somehow creating a group that isn't tied to some level of government based on what we're trying to create. And that's because the fear is then that gets those funds encumbered some way.
So it actually is, the fear is the independence of the board as opposed to it being a government function.
Well, I think it's the parameters around what it is. And it's, I think, the vagueness. And this has nothing to do with the people at the table or the state of Arizona. We're in 37 states. We've had issues where these things have been created and they've turned into a nightmare. They end up putting a fee on us that we collect from our customers.
On the Universal Service Fund?
No, a separate fee outside of USF
for something else, right?
For broadband development that we collect for our customers. But there was, in some cases, the funds in other states have been swept. So I go out, it's the same thing with the 911 fund and the irritation we've had with that is I collect that from my customer, one of about 80 different line items.
I look at the bottom of my bill,
And it becomes the Christmas tree with no accountability because no one, they can hide behind that. And they think it's us that's doing the damage to them as a customer. Yeah, I can tell you that's real because I get it all the time. Why are you doing this to us? It's like, I have not, I'm mandated to do this.
Mike Golden,
that becomes a fear.
Getting back to your point, I don't think that I hear him saying that it's got to be ADOT. It could be asset, but it's got to be, if there's judgments on stewardship of dollars, then it's got to have some accountability and some controls from a legislative or existing government rules as to how that works.
Yeah, I hear them saying that they would trust asset more than an independent board because the independent board has no checks on it. Is really, I guess.
And it can change dramatically based on change. You know, the one thing about it being in the government is there's more consistency, there's more continuity than if you have an independent board. That can change. Individuals come in, come out constantly. Well, I think there's a little more.
There are some checks and balances built into the makeup of the board right now. Substantial.
But individual members still would.
We require, the board was, added language was added from the counties that they wanted to see at least one elected county official there. And the tribes, we indicated there was.
It's not necessarily the county or the tribes.
Yeah, it's not the makeup of the board.
The makeup. It's those individuals. When you put an independent board on, the difficulty you find is that continuity for what's the goal, where are we trying to get changes, and you restart the wheel.
And my next point was that there is also substantial limiting language as to what the board does.
Yeah, but Dale, to be honest with you, we always thought that there was value in the independence of a board. We're now hearing a different, perspective.
Well, there is if you consider if all the board is going to do is give advice and counsel. Again, as soon as the board assumes jurisdiction of money, that totally changes the equation.
And to Galen's point about having a credibility factor and having, I mean, asset and that office has the credibility factor now to be the advocate you're describing versus a yet to be created.
This is the first time, folks, that I've clearly understood the objection, so that's good. And so I think now one of the things we got to do is we got to really step back and think about it, involve Aaron, who is state CIO in the conversation, and probably the director of ADOA as well, and find out where they sit about that. But at least I can articulate it now, so that's good.
Let me ask a question. Is it a good thing that we have survivability beyond an administration with this board?
I don't necessarily, I mean, that doesn't, help me one way or another. I think at the end of the day, and Ron's exactly right. I mean, when you start getting into the fees and the other things that slide, we would have more comfort knowing we're dealing with a state agency.
Yeah, because there still will be fees and there still will be all of those kinds of impacts, but you're just saying that your sense of good governance, I guess,
Right.
is higher.
And it's from practical experiences in other places that have really blown up and become very ugly at the end of the day.
And in fairness, I just want to, that's probably where because we operate in multiple states, there have been implosions other places, so it is not meant to be specific to, as you said earlier, to people in the room. There's just been models that haven't.
Sure.
Have there been models in other states that have worked?
Galen, I just want to comment
There are
really quick.
upside as well as downside.
I just want to comment real quick on the comment you had. Existing or surviving from one administration to the next, I think if this operation were to prove itself as valuable, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't continue. I mean, any incoming administration is going to realize the value of connectivity.
It's not a partisan.
Sort of transcends partisanship.
Plus, if you just think about the functions that ADOA handles overall, I mean, they don't go away from administration to administration.
And I understand that.
You know.
There was also another point, by the way, some of the modeling that went into this was, and we started with a much different bill, by the way, as you can, if you go back and look at 1403, it was based on something that was done in 2007. A little bit of it was at least. And that was based on essentially a letter received from Quest at the time.
Quest doesn't exist anymore.
I understand that. But it was also representative of.
He's always the historian.
I just want to remind him that the company and the policies don't exist. They don't move forward.
But it was where, in fact, the idea of an Arizona Universal Service Fund for broadband was, in fact, and I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but it, in fact, was presented as a good idea, and as it came from Quest. Now, Quest doesn't exist anymore.
We were purchased by a company that makes money, yes.
But this is Ron again.
Luckily, I mean, the thing is, like I've always said, is the federal stuff is moving faster than I've told you a million times, than I ever could have anticipated. We just put reply comments in 2 days ago to the notice of proposed rulemaking, so I think, to everyone's point, timing's is pretty good in that sense, because I think what you're trying to accomplish and what the federal government will probably write will probably help move this along a heck of a lot faster, because there's going to be the federal help to facilitate what you want to do.
Well, and we hope in concert with you guys, we really are trying to create a model in Arizona that can be, widely emulated as the feds begin to catch up and move along.
Yes,
Well, and to that point, our job is not just to complain, but also to try to be proactive, to offer some alternative suggestions. And maybe we could take a stab at generating a thought process about how the end goal might be accomplished by working through ADOA and asset, looking at the bill, trying to do some rewrites, providing some language for you just as a starting point, because we just don't want to drop the problem on your lap and then walk away. I think it's our job.
That's great. Well, and our commitment is to continue to keep interacting and iterating this too as we work through these issues. But can I also take, though, that there's general agreement that we need some kind of legislation, even if we do this inside the context of asset or ADOA?
Agree.
I think that's true.
Okay, good. So basically, what happens is 1403 gets modified to reflect that change in in the governance structure is really the way to.
Yeah.
Well, is the objection to the office if it's under asset, or is the objection to an independent board as opposed to an advisory?
Well, that's what I was trying to get clarity on, because I think just in internal conversations, asset would like to see this be, or ADOA would like to see this be a discrete functionality.
It's really a program. It's not
Yeah,
really an office per se.
But they tend to call programs that, if they are big enough and substantial enough.
But also sort of brings images of FTEs, and I mean, it's an image, I'm not sure a good one you want necessarily around kind of creating this
Well,
function.
let us have an internal discussion about what it might be called.
I want to go back. This is Ron. I want to go back to the question that was asked before. does anybody know of anybody who has been able to achieve this in an effective way in any other state that would make sense, where you would have where maybe an ADOT equivalent actually has taken on the function, or a asset or equivalent has taken on some function with some external guidance that they can seek if they want to, but just as a guidance point of view?
Right. Maybe a question would be, is there a western state that has? Because I understand Massachusetts, but the dead
I like that, and I
North
also,
Carolina has.
I'd also like to suggest that if they take Ron's question and say from the vantage point of the operators.
Yeah, because
Right.
to give you
That's
an
the
example,
input we're
North
trying to
Carolina
get.
actually costs consumers more,
Yeah.
and that's
I don't
not the
think-
model we're looking
As
at,
in Massachusetts.
right?
Yeah, I don't think they're a particularly good example. One of the things we think is a unique distinction about what we're proposing to do with the two bills is, first of all, the idea that it's empty conduit, as opposed to the state being in the business of deploying fiber capacity. And we think that's a critically important distinction. And,
Because it purely bundles the right of way,
Yeah.
nothing more, nothing less,
exactly.
which is the state
Right.
issue. That's
And
the
there's very
barrier.
few states like us in just the makeup and how roads are
In
built.
many dimensions.
Yeah, exactly.
And the
So,
land jurisdiction.
yeah.
We like to think we're a little bit, I mean, I've been watching the national scene now for a long time. And,
And in it, I know, it's, in the state, the problem is, the early states took away local authority.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of
and
moving
we saw
parts.
the fiasco that took place in Montana, we saw the fiasco that took place in Indiana,
Michigan with the.
Michigan.
Well,
so-
and
So
we
the
do-
answer is,
So far, I'm hearing the answer is no, that
And
nobody
to Ron's
can think
question,
of,
I think we do have an opportunity, which is what your goal was a year ago when you came to meet with the association members, to do this unique entity for Arizona, because we are unique. We're governed uniquely in some regard on the cable side, certainly. It's not identical from state to state, so I don't know that you want to look to another model per se, and I think the credibility factor is still here with ASSET, whatever it was called, its predecessor entity, which is why we keep coming back to that. But I think that there's some confidence level in that system. So we could certainly, if it's of use, I don't want to give you some starting point of what we're describing verbally in a written format for you to share with
yeah,
Aaron.
I think all input like that's
Okay.
useful. I mean, so, and then, we'll put it in the digestion.
Yeah, and obviously that's going to need vetting and,
Right.
Very,
redoing.
no, CenturyLink covers 34 states,
Right.
37 states, I apologize. CenturyLink is obviously operating in those and has some maturity in some of those states, more so than they do for the ones that were purchased. I would love to see something that's been done, and you pointed out in a western state.
Well, because you got to understand, we're in a unique. This merger has been consummated now for 10 months.
Right.
What CenturyTel did is completely different than what CenturyLink thinks 10 months later. What Qwest did is completely different than what CenturyLink thinks 10 months later. I mean, even the company that started in those east of the Mississippi states, CenturyTel, a whole different world, even in the last 2 years for that company, from what they may have agreed upon, 6, 7 years ago, because they were a small rural telephone provider that didn't have a lot of customers. I mean, it's in a sense similar to what Comcast did in the cable industry. They have tripled in size in 2 years.
Right.
So the dynamic has changed so dramatically. But, to the point, and I think we've been consistent, is we understand, we all want to get, especially on the education side, get to a point that we're making sure that folks in the state are being served. And we're glad that the federal government's looking at that as well. And the other thing, at least from our perspective, I want you to take into consideration, and the reason some of this didn't happen quicker. Well, the previous entity, Qwest, had serious financial constraints, which has, changed dramatically with the new company and our commitment at the ACC and some of those other things. So, I really, we're at a looking forward basis, and I want that to be, the focus, because I think there's a lot of things moving that are all positive that will work with what you're trying to do as we talk this summer.
Yeah.
So I just think there's incredible benefit at the end of the day. We just need to get the language right. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Michael, you often refer to what's happening at the federal level as being very, very important. I find sometimes that what happens at the federal level as being very negative to our state. In a number of instances, and especially the policy of the federal government to reach down past strategic plans that the state may have and mix it up with the local situation.
And dictate at the local level.
I don't think that's ever going to change.
We understand that. So
a Republican.
I understand that, but one of the concerns that I have is that we do have a cogent state policy, and the local communities are looking up to the state and have confidence now that certain things that we're doing are reflecting their needs and desires. And I'd like to continue that process where we have a partnership between local communities and state level issues, especially in this arena. And they have confidence that we're moving in the right direction right now with regard to this process. And they would, I think, rather deal with a state level entity than have to deal with the mix of voices that composes the federal voice.
But just so you know, this goes back to the whole discussion around funding. The funding, the amount, the billions that we're talking about, reality can't be done without the federal government.
Oh, absolutely.
And it is, when we look at, okay, when we're going to ask for funds, we're taking it down literally to the street level and understanding where we need to be, especially in this project, and where we need to go. And the good thing is that's done. We did that. It was a 12-month process. It was painful. We didn't get a dime of stimulus grants. But the process, at least, the work has been done. So from a perspective of being able to identify those.
So you know where you're starting from.
You know you're planning on.
Exactly. So I think it's complementary to what you're doing. It's just, this is one of those weird times where what the federal government's doing, I think, is taking the right approach. They've tried 3 or 4 different ideas. I think they finally got to the point, and now you have all providers negotiating on this, and that's the important thing.
Right.
You create less conflict for yourself at the state level when all of us are engaged in a negotiation at the federal level.
Well,
it's a little easier.
Yeah, I'm sitting here now kind of reacting to the new input that I'm understanding and looking, we have, as you well know, we have widespread support for the 2 bills even as they are currently written. And so the question is, if we start to change specifically this governance model on 1403, will the other pros, the other people who are for this, the communities, the counties, the various
tribes,
the tribes, all of these, will they see any negatives in what we've just described as an alternative possible way, of proceeding on this, especially with regard to government?
I think at the end of the day, if I'm them as a stakeholder, and I know there's controls around the financing, that they've got some understanding, okay, this isn't just a program everyone's saying is going to work, and then the money isn't controlled properly. I think it would actually give them a little bit more comfort at the end of the day, Mike.
Well, I suspect you may be right, but one of the things we're obviously now going to need to do, because we're in a process, we're going to have to now revet all of that across all of those stakeholders if we go that way. And
cities felt confident they had their input with regard to.
As an instance of one representing.
Well, yeah, as an instance of one, only representing myself. I would say the initial reaction to the bill was hesitation, because we didn't know what this office would do, and we're very wary, I would say, of the state. The state coming in and telling us what to do. So we've just been trying to make sure this does no harm.
But it's the same limiting language with regard to, the key concern of most other stakeholders who had any control over right-of-way was encroachment of their rights.
Correct.
By this into the over right-of-way control.
Right. So as long as our control's not impinged, we don't care if it's not impinged by the state or not impinged by the board or not impinged by us. It's against impingement.
And I presume whatever change we might consider making would leave those limitations still in place. So given that that's the case, what's your?
So I would say, from our perspective, I would say we're neutral on it. It wasn't that we felt like, this office needs to do it. I think that obviously the concept of better connectivity, and again, urban areas, we have pretty good connectivity.
Right. Yeah, this really affects other communities outside.
So I don't think if this bill were to go away, if it were to die, we wouldn't care, but we would be very, we're still going to watch if it, comes out in some other form.
And I think just maybe following up on Gina's point is when we because you gave us a good lead into the league and into the county supervisors, but at the League of Cities and Towns, the folks there certainly echoed the first thought of do no harm, and then they did take it a next step in terms of what's the involvement and
well, and I think there was support for the policy of the notion that there would be some jurisdiction over this area. So there wasn't an objection. There wasn't an objection to that.
And so I think we need to go back and revet, as you mentioned, Mike. But I think we probably will see more concern about the loss of the board at the county level than with the league.
Yeah, that's what I suspect as well. Mark, are you still on the call? Oh, okay.
Emerson is joining.
Here's one other thought to consider too, because you have what I consider to be a very robust and engaged broadband development. Digital Arizona Council.
We changed our name on it.
Digital Arizona Council.
We just needed a sexier name.
Yeah.
ABDC.
Well, and my point being is that in an advisory role and having a board without restraint on who you can put on it and the diversity of people, you can be inclusive in terms of getting input. It may be more than one Indian tribe in Arizona that cares about this issue, and they may have an issue with whoever the tribal representative
Sure,
is.
and there may be differences.
You can include him. Yeah, you can be more inclusive. You can have more city representation.
And in fact, there are tribes that are cable television operators who were never in the discussion on this language at all. And I think there is.
They were just counting on you.
Well, and in some cases they can, because in some cases they are members of the Cable Association. So I think you're right. I think there's, much as I just articulated, probably, as we all said, general consensus for the outcome, the goal of what 1403 wants to do. How we get there, I think you may be surprised that you may find some entities who actually are happier with restructuring how you get there as opposed to simply just being neutral and asking for no harm.
Right.
We do have a time constraint on this whole situation, and it has to do with the federal grant that is helping to fund assistance to whatever entity we set up. Right now, we do not have monies allocated from DOA to provide the assistance that's being called on in the first few years. That money will go away, and hopefully we will prove a point and as to success, if you will, and somewhere along the line convince 80OA that funding should come and a request for funding for support should come from DOA to the legislature to in fact continue this office. Right now we have some constraints.
That remains to be seen.
And of course I'm suggesting though that right now we do have a grant in place that is helping to start all of this. Eventually those funds will run out. And then where will we
like
be?
any startup, we have seed money.
We get to start over
we don't
again,
necessarily have an assurance of long-term funding. So,
Galen, what's your point?
My point is that we have the opportunity now to do these things and get them started. Whether they
nobody's saying that we shouldn't.
My point is that would we even be able to start this whole process without a grant?
But we are doing that.
I understand that.
So
we are doing that.
So it's a point that doesn't need to be made.
Okay, but if 1403 goes away because we can't...
We're still doing your pilot project, we're still looking at the pilot.
And 1403 is not going away. It's simply, the proposal is to change its governance structure. So,
but...
And I think with some demonstrated
as a point of urgency.
You're going to have the opportunity to make the case to do things
well, and like any startup, if you're successful in the early stages of your startup, then you get to keep going. Right.
Can I ask you guys about one thing? Because the other sticking point that I think we wanted to raise was the open-ended fee authority. Haven't really had a conversation about what those administrative fees are to provide services under this article, what do you guys have thought about, what does that look
Well,
like?
the thoughts are that basically there is going to be an administrative process in which we have to understand and get quotes from ADOT on what a particular construction project will look like. We're going to have to probably fund those quotes. After we get that back, there's going to be a series of meetings that need to be held and processes and papers written to describe what the projects are. All of those have costs that relate to a specific project. And so the notion there is to recover those direct costs as administrative fees.
But I sense that if we could get ADOT to give a definitive list of at least the items of what would be included, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that Floyd may be willing to do that, given where he's at now on the process.
But he'll give you the items, but he can't price them.
Yeah, I'm not sure he can price them. His point was, when asked before, Ron, is each one of these things is a very specific case, with specific issues that affect price. And so he really needs to take it as, it's this section of road from here to here, and then I can get back to you with an estimate of the cost.
And can I ask you one question?
Right, I understand, but there's got to be a list of generic things that have to be included, and even though he doesn't have the price for them.
Yeah, and I'm reasonably certain, without having asked him, that we can probably get that.
Just something I have, because in my mind, I want to make sure this doesn't become an impediment. The regulatory rulemaking bills that are moving, wonder how that, I know, I'm trying to think how that impinges ADOT and how long that rules. I mean, granted, there'll be a process, and maybe that's where that gets defined, but if those bills, which, again, I'm not going to speculate if they do pass, it's just something to be thinking about in the future. Process for setting that and what you're going to have to do to overcome that and get that done.
But the underlying general notion is basically the actual direct cost, being recovered and reassessed as fees.
Other than the jurisdictional issue of whether there's been the proper authority delegated to ASSET to essentially take over this, in your discussion in the beginning, was there an objection to this coming under ASSET?
That's a good question. I think the governor's indicated to us that it would, first of all, we couldn't offer any kind of bill that had any money attached to it because there were other issues that were more important than this from ASSET. So the governor basically was, and we've quoted this before and you love the term, positively agnostic. Okay?
So this would be seen then,
Go
if it
forth
had
and
changed?
multiply on your own
Yeah,
as much as
this
you
could
possibly
be
can.
seen by the governor's office, but I don't want to say that it would be. It could be seen.
But there's no fiscal note.
Yeah, but I think the fact that we can make the case that there's no fiscal impact should leaven that, But we're going to have to probably do some explaining.
Yeah, as soon as you put a fiscal price on this, then it's going to go through the budget office, and then the support that you have in the legislature is going to just.
Yeah, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Maybe 4 or 5 years from now, after big success, we take that on, but not now, for sure.
I think there's a policy change.
So, Bob, do you have any thoughts about all of this discussion?
Well, I think this is part of the necessary process.
Okay.
You got the bill out there, and then you drew attention, and started to get
Boy,
feedback,
have we.
and now you got to sort of
Deal with that feedback.
way it works.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's a level of integrity in this whole process that I think that is commendable. Because of the nature of the openness we've had, the ability, thank you, Mike Keeling, for the openness and willingness to listen, and nobody's been...
And I think Galen, as a historian, would certainly confirm, CenturyLink is not Quest.
Thank you very much, sir.
That's going to be my new tagline for the company. It'll be a new commercial next week, yes.
I was here during facility board.
So, are there any other...
Are there any other concerns that we haven't talked about?
The only thing I'm going to check into, because someone brought it up to me today, and again, it hasn't come up in any other conversations, was do we need any language about federal, if federal law preempts, which we know it in most senses it does anyways, whether we need anything or not. I'm going to check and let you
Well,
know.
and we did have that in the initial,
Yeah.
going to the legislative council language on it, Mike.
Right.
And that's when it was stripped out, because their perspective, they have to put it everywhere, they put it anywhere.
Also, Ledge Council took out the term federal.
Exactly.
And I think their argument is, if it's preempted,
It's preempted anyways, okay,
Right.
but that was
So we're not special in that.
at least knowing that that's where they were
But that's
on it.
exactly
Okay.
how that was,
Okay.
how we,
But that was
our
the question
trial
that was
balloon
brought
and
up
what
to me.
happened.
Yeah.
Well, this is another concern, it's sort of bringing back to, I'm sensitive to coming in and saying, as Bob knows in the process, we have issues and not proffering any solutions. If we could take a few hours and put together some suggested language changes and ship them for you just to look at as a starting point,
Right.
that way we've not shirked on our duty of trying to be a problem solver.
We appreciate
Okay,
that.
I want to make sure we do that.
We do appreciate that.
Expedite the process.
Yeah.
And in fact, do you have the electronic version of the latest? If you guys don't, I'm glad to.
Probably be
send
easier
that.
to
Do you
start
have the
from
one
an
with
editable.
the committee
Because
amendment incorporated? That would be
I've
incredible.
been working off of,
I'll send the latest version.
the electronic version.
In full color.
Yeah,
It
which
shows the amendment as a proposed amendment on the site. It doesn't show it engrossed into.
yeah, that's been our challenge.
Well, and that's the other,
Big
this last thing that Michael brought up too needs to be for sure.
Yeah.
We need to know what versions we're dealing with. in the-
Yeah.
And it was the second to last, so you got second amendment in the top is where that language was inserted. It just didn't show it in the, when I was.
Right.
And
There were
and
3
that's
amendments.
And I'm not sure if that's a catch-up issue,
It could be.
or which it probably is, but we need to go
It could
find that
also
out.
be just in the rush of the committee, they may not have done everything they're supposed to do. That happens.
Or they submitted the wrong amendment.
Or they
to the
submitted the wrong
secretary.
amendment, exactly, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
I never do that.
You opened with an original question here as to what are the numbers of availability, and can we agree to disagree?
Well, I'd rather we agree than agree to disagree.
I think what's going to happen is we will in fact try to get a report out that will show a percentage of availability from the actual mapping data.
Yeah, so we'll produce the facts that we have and disclose how that analysis was done.
Right.
Because, again, we haven't seen that, so
Yeah,
I mean,
and that's what we're
But that's
trying to
our
get
next
done
step
within the next
for
week
you.
or so.
Right.
And then what we're interested in is your counter to that. I mean, what processes and
We
data
think the
are-
number will be lower than the 96.6. How much it is, but we'll wait and see. I think the thing we can agree upon is that there is a delta between availability across the state and, there are numbers in the hundreds of thousands of people impacted, whether the number is 5% or 96.6% availability, and whether the number is 89.8% availability. There's a substantial number of people impacted in this
But
state.
again, too, we need to find out, because
Galen?
a substantial portion of the state we don't cover
Right.
up by Kingman, and that's, I think, where's that data?
And so the
We'll
point
work
is,
with you on that.
there is a need
This may be
that we can agree upon.
This may be a moot argument. We've agreed what we're going to do as a process review, so stop talking.
But and we will be with you on that message.
And Ron, I think you had a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, can we not keep bringing that up?
Yeah.
I would just hope,
Momentum is a positive, not a negative edge.
And then, yes.
Should not have the same effect that you did.
Oh, and Emerson, Emerson, are you still on the call?
Yes.
Emerson, did you have any items you'd like to add to the conversation also?
No, thank you.
So Susan did a great job.
I can check in with you afterwards and give you a quick demo, but I think we're where we need to be.
Okay, yes, Mike.
Thanks, Mike, or Galen, if you guys decide to go down the route of compiling that data, before you do a dump publicly, I would hope we could look at it and respond.
That's our next step.
I would hope, so that way we're not trying to confuse the general public.
That's not our,
that's our next
we'll
step.
talk to you, and then we might eventually decide that it needs to be public, but it would be after we have dialogue with you guys.
And just to make sure that we're, this is not, this is something out of the dark or out of the blue. This is what's been collected over the years, and what we're doing right now is the data that was collected from the 74 providers and that was submitted last October 1, is the data that is that's being overlaid, census block, not tract, but block, the smaller entity, by census block with the 2010 population census, and now what happens, and these are the NTIA issues here, but if there's a particular broadband user or available user within 7 to 10 days that can be turned up in that census block is turned on. And so what this
So that winds up overstating actual availability.
So what this analysis does is it turns on all the population in that census block as if they all were able to receive. Now, in some census blocks, that's going to be true. In others, it will not, and so there's going to be some overstatement, and we'll go into some of those nuances, but that's what it is.
Now, I recognize, and this is always dangerous, but it's data point of 1, which is my particular address on Windmere Court in Sedona, Arizona. The broadband mapping data, both federal and state, says that I have both DSL service available and cable service available. I have neither available. And so we recognize you've got to be careful in extrapolating from that single data point, but it reflects what he's talking about as a generic issue with the process in which the mapping data has been published
I'm going to
publicly.
give you the reverse. You take my home address and the census block that says neither is available, and I have both, so they're out.
Well,
so, I mean, we can kind of watch it.
Actually,
It's a fluky
but it just points to some of the built-in inaccuracies of the way the data is collected. And so,
well, and I think it also reflects the fact that you may have people, and this is true in our service areas, we have an obligation to serve homes with a video product if it meets a certain density and if it's a certain distance from our network. There are people we will absolutely serve if they will help pay the construction costs of going to, a mile to get to their 3-acre lot. And so the can we serve issue may be a bigger product of the willingness of the customer to foot the bill.
To pick up those extra costs,
exactly.
right.
So that can we serve? Yes, we can.
Although in my instance, this is just an ordinary suburban block, and people on, block on the other side, block on all 4 sides of me, all have service.
But I'm just saying sort of what our issue is in North Scottsdale, where you have huge lots and, or even, some of the communities like, what was the one in Curtis Valley? Clearwater Hills, County Island, right?
So the PME comes to forward. So what are our objectives out of the meeting? What are we going to do? We're going to work together on developing numbers.
Yes. And we should have those, project those by the end of this week.
And we're going to get back some language,
suggested language.
1403 to get to you.
And what kind of time frames?
We're going to have an internal discussion with the powers that be inside ADOA about how this governance shift might be accepted or worse.
Right, on the board.
Yeah, with regard to having an independent board, not having an independent board, and all of those issues. And is there any other?
I just think this is a really great meeting.
So 3 big issues, right? And as far as, not everyone was here today, but are there any other issues that anyone's aware of that people have that this group should be entertaining as well?
I mean, let me just circle back with Jerry.
Yeah, I know AT&T gave you guys their stuff, right?
Right, they did.
And is everything they put out there acceptable?
Everything that they've asked for has so far been incorporated.
Well, let me speak to that because yes and no. Jerry is taking back the language that was incorporated to his corporate attorneys, and we don't have that circle back.
Yeah, so it's language that he asked for, but it hasn't been blessed internally inside AT&T.
And so that's his process, and it's in.
You wouldn't know about that, would you?
The other takeaway that's kind of mutual is making sure we are all working on the same page. That's what the legislature has.
Yes.
There are multiple, sounds like there's at least 2 generations floating around.
Yeah.
Or not floating around, as the case may be.
At least we have a standard to start with.
Yeah. Now, Senator Driggs, to his credit, has been very willing to work with Mike to keep incorporating these kinds of ongoing or rolling changes as we move through the process.
We are now out of his domain, however. The next committee that I saw on the list was appropriations, and I have heard that maybe appropriations might not be
as flexible.
Well, no, I've heard that they probably won't hear it. They'll take a pass on it.
But Senator Driggs has believed that we have one more shot before going forward, and so he's worked with us quite well, and he's I shouldn't say promised, but he's indicated that we can bring additional language.
We have
to
other
him.
sponsors.
And he's well, but I really, he's been wonderful, and I think for all of us, and what he would like for us is to get on the same song sheet and give him the final version that does make sense to all of us, and I think that's incumbent for us to do.
If there's another committee.
Senator Probst has not, got the bill assigned to it as well.
It is assigned to Pro right now.
But we hear they may skip it because there's no monetary issue. Right.
But they do have it on their agenda, and I haven't seen the schedule yet.
It's not on this week, but they met already, so.
It's on the list of,
This is a very bad week or two for that. They're going to be busy.
On the upshot, if we can get the issues resolved in a clean version, it might be worth considering doing a strike everything amendment so we have one clean bill coming out.
Instead of all these separate,
Exactly, with all the amendments and the pieces and parts.
Under 1403.
Operationally,
1403 is now one consistent clean bill, and it does have many of the changes. 1403 does not look like that one.
But it's a good suggestion that an entirely clean version would be good. Good, well, thank you all.
Are we adjourned?
Good participation. Yes. Thank everyone on the line also. Ron, everyone for your comments.
Thank you.
Emerson. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The conference will now end.